My husband brought his mistress into our bed. I packed my 3 children into the car, with nothing but trash bags for luggage, and drove through a freezing Chicago storm to my parents' house. My father opened the door, looked at my shivering children, dripping mud onto his pristine Persian rug, and slowly closed it in our faces. My sister texted the family group chat calling me impulsive. My brother claimed he had no space. I picked up our garbage bags, walked back to my freezing car, and whispered 5 words that would change our lives forever. I am Natalie, 32 years old, and a commercial landscape architect and urban planner. I always thought family was supposed to be your foundation when your world collapsed. I learned the hard way that some foundations are built on quicksand. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after the people who should have loved you threw you to the wolves. The collapse of my life began on a Tuesday afternoon. I had finished a site survey earlier than expected and drove home to our suburban house hoping to surprise my husband Ryan. Ryan was 34, a finance executive who wore expensive suits, cared entirely too much about his country club membership, and always treated my career as a cute little hobby. I walked through the front door, kicked off my work boots, and immediately noticed a pair of red designer heels in the hallway. I heard laughter coming from our master bedroom. I did not scream or cry when I pushed the door open. I just stood there staring at Ryan, and a woman I recognized as a junior analyst from his firm. Ryan did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed a towel, and looked at me with sheer annoyance. He actually had the nerve to tell me to calm down and wait downstairs while his guest got dressed. He said I was overreacting, that men in his position have certain needs, and that I was always too busy looking at blueprints to pay attention to him. I did not wait downstairs. I went straight to the kids' rooms. I grabbed black plastic trash bags from the kitchen because I did not even have the time to find our suitcases. I stuffed Leo, Mia, and Sam into their coats. Leo is 8, Mia is 6, and Sam is barely 4. They were confused, asking why we were rushing out into the freezing rain. I told them we were going on a sudden adventure to visit their grandparents. I threw the garbage bags full of their clothes into the trunk of my car, strapped the kids into their car seats, and drove away without looking back at Ryan. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, lived in a massive, perfectly manicured estate in an affluent Chicago suburb. It took me 40 minutes to drive there through the blinding rain. By the time I pulled into their circular driveway, the kids were shivering and hungry. I carried Sam on my hip, grabbed the trash bags with my free hand, and ushered Leo and Mia onto the massive front porch. I rang the doorbell, shivering in my soaked jacket. My father, Richard, opened the heavy oak door. The warm, golden light of the foyer spilled out onto the porch. Behind him, I could see my mother, Eleanor, holding a glass of red wine, wearing a cashmere sweater. "Dad, please let us in," I pleaded, my teeth chattering. "Ryan had someone else in our bed. I just need the sofa for tonight until I can figure things out." My father did not step aside to let us in. Instead, his eyes darted down to the children's wet shoes. They were dripping muddy water onto the marble entryway and threatening the edge of his expensive Persian rug. He frowned, his jaw tightening. Eleanor stepped up behind him, peering over his shoulder. Her face contorted into a look of absolute disgust. "You always blow things out of proportion, Natalie," she said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "Ryan is a highly successful man. He provides a beautiful home for you. Men make mistakes, especially when their wives neglect them. You are always running around construction sites in dirt and mud. What did you expect?" I stared at her, the freezing rain soaking through my clothes. "Mom, I just caught him with another woman in my own house. I have nowhere else to go tonight." My mother took a sip of her wine and sighed dramatically. "Look at your sister Vanessa. She knows how to keep a man happy." Jamal is an incredibly successful African-American real estate developer building a billion-dollar empire. He deals with massive stress, but Vanessa makes sure their home is a peaceful sanctuary. She dresses beautifully. She hosts his partners. She acts like a proper wife. You just create drama. Go back home and apologize to Ryan for making a scene." "Apologize to him?" I asked, my voice cracking. "For finding him cheating on me?" My father placed his hand on the door handle. "We are hosting a charity brunch tomorrow morning, Natalie. We cannot have 3 noisy kids running around and ruining the preparations. You need to grow up and fix your marriage. We spent a fortune on your wedding, and we are not going to let you throw it away over a tantrum." "Dad, it is freezing out here," I begged, pulling Sam closer to my chest. "Just for tonight, please." My father looked at me, then looked at the small puddles of water forming around my children's feet. "Clean up your mess, Natalie," he said coldly. And then he slowly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The lock clicked. I stood there on the porch, the rain beating down on my back, listening to the absolute silence from inside that massive empty house. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with numb fingers. It was a notification from our family group chat. My sister Vanessa had sent a message. "Mom just told me Natalie showed up looking like a drowned rat with trash bags. Do not let her in. She is just acting impulsive and trying to cause drama because Ryan probably told her to dress better. We cannot have her ruining the family image right before Jamal invites the mayor to dinner next week." I stared at the screen, hoping anyone would defend me. Instead, my younger brother Brandon chimed in. "Bro, she better not bring those loud kids here. I just bought a $5,000 PC setup for my streaming room. I do not have space for her baggage. Let her figure it out." Nobody had space. Nobody cared. I was the family scapegoat, the one who chose a messy hands-on career in urban planning, instead of marrying for status or staying in my lane. Because I did not fit their pristine, superficial mold, my pain was just an inconvenience to them. I put the phone back in my pocket. I looked at Leo, who was holding Mia's hand tightly. He looked up at me with big, terrified eyes. "Are we going inside, Mom?" he asked, his little voice trembling from the cold. "No, sweetie," I said, forcing a calm smile I absolutely did not feel. "Grandma and Grandpa are not home. We are going to have a special camping trip in the car tonight." I picked up the garbage bags, ushered my children back into the freezing car, and turned the heater on full blast. I drove away from that wealthy neighborhood, away from the glowing mansions and the people who shared my blood but possessed absolutely no heart. I found a 24-hour Walmart parking lot that was well lit. I parked the car under a street lamp for safety. I scrounged around the center console and the bottom of my purse, counting exactly $4.75 in quarters and dimes. I left the kids locked safely in the warm car with the doors secured, and I ran inside the store. I bought the cheapest loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter I could find. I could feel the cashier staring at my wet clothes and my handful of coins, but I swallowed my pride. Pride does not feed starving children. Back in the car, I made sandwiches using a plastic knife from the glove compartment. I handed them back to the kids. Leo took his sandwich but immediately broke off a piece to help feed Sam. Watching my 8-year-old son show more compassion and responsibility than my entire adult family completely broke me for a brief second. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and stinging against my freezing skin. But then the urban planner inside me took over. When a building collapses, you do not sit in the rubble and cry over the broken glass. You clear the debris. You assess the foundation. You pour concrete, and you rebuild something stronger, something that can withstand any storm. My family thought I was weak. They thought because I did not care about designer bags or country clubs, I was a failure who would eventually come crawling back begging for their help. They fundamentally misunderstood who I was. I looked at my children sleeping in the back seat, huddled together under the coats I had thrown over them. I turned around, gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and stared out at the rain hitting the windshield. I made a promise to the universe right then and there. I whispered 5 words into the quiet, cold air of that car. "You will beg for this." I did not sleep that night. I kept the car running periodically to ensure the heater stayed on, watching the parking lot for any signs of danger. I spent the hours mentally cataloging every asset, every skill, and every piece of knowledge I possessed. I had my degree. I had my license in landscape architecture. I had my mind. They could lock me out of their houses, but they could never take my intellect. Morning broke with a pale gray light over the Walmart parking lot. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bitter cold. At exactly 7 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a rapid succession of alerts. I opened my banking app. Notification. Joint checking account withdrawal. Balance 0. Notification. Joint savings account withdrawal. Balance 0. Notification. Credit card suspended. Credit. Ryan had been busy while I was sleeping in a parking lot. He had completely drained every single joint account we shared and canceled the credit cards attached to his name. My chest tightened, but I refused to panic. A moment later, a text message arrived from Ryan. I froze the accounts. You want to act crazy and run off with the kids, you can deal with the consequences. Come home right now, sign the divorce papers my lawyer is drafting today, and give me full custody. If you do, I will let you take the old sedan and give you a few $1,000s to leave town. If you do not, you can figure out how to live under a bridge. He thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought my parents rejecting me meant I had zero support system and zero options. He believed his money and his status made him untouchable. Ryan, just like my parents, just like Vanessa and Jamal, suffered from a fatal flaw. They confused wealth with power. They confused cruelty with strength. I looked down at my phone. I did not reply to his text. Instead, I opened my contacts and found the number for a lawyer friend I had met during a city zoning project 2 years ago. It was time to stop playing the victim and start pouring the concrete for my new empire. They wanted a war. I was going to give them a masterclass in demolition. I called Allison, a razor-sharp family attorney I collaborated with during a complex commercial zoning dispute downtown last year. I explained the drained accounts, the locked doors, and the custody threat. Allison did not offer empty sympathy. She offered a timeline. Within 48 hours, we were standing in the sterile, echoing hallways of the Cook County Family Court for an emergency custody and financial support hearing. I wore my sharpest navy blue suit, the one I usually reserve for presenting multi-million-dollar urban development proposals to the city council. I had secured a temporary hotel room for my children, using a line of credit Ryan did not know existed, an account tied solely to my business tax ID. When I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, my heart slammed against my ribs. Ryan sat at the respondent table, looking completely relaxed in his custom Italian suit. He leaned back, whispering something to a lawyer who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. But that was not what made my breath catch in my throat. Sitting in the gallery directly behind Ryan were my parents. Richard and Eleanor sat upright, dressed impeccably, offering their silent but absolute support to the man who had brought his mistress into my bed. My mother caught my eye and offered a slow, disapproving shake of her head. She looked at my suit, a silent judgment that I was trying too hard to look like a professional. My father refused to even meet my gaze. They had chosen their side. They chose the man with the massive portfolio and the country club pedigree over their own daughter and grandchildren. I sat down next to Allison, placing my briefcase on the table. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Davis, called the hearing to order. Ryan's attorney stood up immediately. He painted a picture of me that was entirely fictional, but incredibly damaging. He claimed I was emotionally unstable, prone to hysterical outbursts, and financially destitute. Your Honor. My client's wife packed their 3 young children into a car in the middle of a severe rainstorm with nothing but garbage bags. His lawyer stated, his voice ringing with manufactured outrage. She forced those children to sleep in a Walmart parking lot. She has no stable income, no permanent residence, and her own parents are sitting right here in this courtroom to testify that she showed up at their home behaving erratically. My client simply froze the joint accounts to protect their assets from her reckless spending. We request immediate full custody for the father who can provide a safe, luxurious home and a stable environment. I listened to the absolute assassination of my character. I watched my father nod slightly in agreement from the gallery. A year ago, this betrayal would have shattered me into a million pieces. I would have cried. I would have begged the judge to understand. But the woman who cried was left behind in that freezing parking lot. The urban planner in me recognized exactly what Ryan was doing. He was building a false facade to hide a crumbling foundation. Judge Davis turned her stern gaze to my table. Does the petitioner have a response to these allegations? Allison stood up, her posture exuding absolute confidence. Your Honor, the respondent did not freeze those accounts to protect assets. He drained them to commit financial abuse. He deliberately left a mother and 3 young children stranded without a dollar to their name after my client discovered him actively engaging in infidelity in their marital bed. As for my client's financial stability, she is a highly sought-after commercial landscape architect. But more importantly, we need to discuss where those marital funds actually went. Allison opened a manila folder and handed a thick stack of papers to the bailiff who passed them to the judge. She then handed a copy to Ryan's attorney. I watched Ryan's smug expression falter. What Ryan did not know was that a month ago, I noticed a strange discrepancy in our annual tax documents. My best friend Megan is a forensic accountant. I asked her to look into it quietly. She uncovered a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to a massive financial deception. I printed the bank statements, placed them in a secure lockbox at my office, and waited for the right moment. That moment was right now. Your Honor, those documents contain verified wire transfer receipts from the past 6 months, Allison stated clearly. The respondent has systematically funneled exactly $200,000 of marital funds into an offshore shell company registered in Delaware. He drained the joint accounts 2 days ago, attempting to hide the remaining capital and force my client into submission. He is hiding assets, committing financial abuse, and attempting to weaponize the legal system against his wife. The courtroom fell completely silent. Ryan's attorney furiously flipped through the papers, his face turning pale. He leaned over and whispered angrily to Ryan, who suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. In the gallery, my parents sat frozen. They had no idea about the stolen money. They thought they were backing a winner. Judge Davis slammed her hand on the desk, her eyes narrowing at Ryan. You drained the accounts and left your children sleeping in a car while funneling $200,000 into a shell corporation. This court does not look kindly on financial abuse or perjury, sir. The judge did not hesitate. She ordered Ryan to immediately release $75,000 in emergency spousal and child support directly to my private account. She granted me temporary primary custody of the children and ordered Ryan to vacate the marital home pending the divorce settlement. He was also ordered to pay all my legal fees for this hearing. I sat perfectly still, my face completely neutral, while the judge delivered the ruling. Ryan glared at me with pure hatred, but I did not look away. I had won the first battle. I had secured my children and my finances. When the hearing adjourned, I packed my briefcase and walked down the center aisle. I did not stop to look at my parents. They stood up, clearly uncomfortable, realizing they had publicly backed a man who had just been humiliated and exposed by the court. I pushed open the double doors and stepped out into the brightly lit marble hallway. Before I could even take a breath of relief, a figure stepped directly into my path. It was my sister Vanessa. She wore a tailored cream dress, carrying a designer handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. She must have arrived late and waited outside the courtroom. She looked at my navy suit, her lips curling into a familiar, condescending smirk. I heard the judge gave you a little payout, Vanessa said, her tone dripping with absolute arrogance. Do not get too comfortable, Natalie. So what if you have temporary cash? You think a few $1,000s makes you a winner? You publicly humiliated Mom and Dad in there by attacking Ryan. You embarrassed Jamal and me by associating our name with this trashy divorce drama. This whole family has crossed your name off. You are dead to us. I looked at Vanessa, studying her perfectly styled hair and her aggressive posture. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I just tightened my grip on my briefcase, stepped closer, and looked her dead in the eye. You crossed my name off, I replied calmly. Good. Make sure you remember that when your own house of cards comes crashing down. I walked past her, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, leaving her standing there. I had my money, I had my kids, and I had my freedom. But I also knew the war had just begun, and I was already laying the groundwork for my next strike. 2 months passed since that day in family court. The emergency support funds from Ryan allowed me to secure a safe, quiet apartment in a good school district for Leo, Mia, and Sam. It gave us a roof, heat, and groceries, but it did not give me power. I knew perfectly well that Ryan was utilizing every high-priced legal tactic available to drag out the divorce and deplete my resources. I also knew my parents and Vanessa were actively spinning a narrative among Chicago high society, painting me as a hysterical, bitter woman who ruined a perfect marriage out of pure jealousy. I ignored their noise. I threw myself into my work with a relentless, punishing focus. While my family spent their days attending charity luncheons and country club mixers, I spent my nights analyzing city zoning grids and commercial blueprints. As an independent urban planner and commercial landscape architect, I took on grueling municipal contracts that required late nights out in the freezing Chicago wind. That was exactly how I found myself standing on a dimly lit street corner in the Gold Coast district on a freezing November evening. I was conducting a complex underground utility survey for a municipal infrastructure update. I wore heavy waterproof work boots, a thick canvas jacket, and a bright neon reflective safety vest. My hands were freezing as I gripped a thick roll of topographical blueprints and a heavy-duty tablet displaying the city mapping software. I paused to check the geographical coordinates on my screen. When I looked up to verify the street address, my breath caught in my throat. I was standing directly outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of one of the most exclusive, wildly expensive steakhouses in the city. The private dining room was fully illuminated, and I did not need to squint to recognize the people raising crystal champagne flutes inside. There they were. My father, Richard, my mother, Eleanor, my brother, Brandon, my sister, Vanessa, and her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a charismatic, highly influential African-American real estate developer who had recently become the darling of the Chicago financial district. He stood at the head of the long dining table, wearing a bespoke suit, looking every bit the billionaire titan he claimed to be. A massive professionally printed banner hung on the wall behind them. It read, "Celebrating the Emerald Lake Complex, groundbreaking." I knew about the Emerald Lake Complex. Anyone in my industry knew about it. It was a highly publicized $1 billion mixed-use commercial and residential development that Jamal had spent 3 years securing. It was his masterpiece, the project that would permanently cement his legacy and elevate my parents' social status into the stratosphere since they were prominent early investors. I stood on the sidewalk in the biting cold, watching my family laugh and toast to their massive wealth while I held a digital measuring laser in my freezing, calloused hands. The heavy brass doors of the restaurant suddenly pushed open. My younger brother Brandon stepped out onto the sidewalk to light a cigarette. Brandon was 29, wearing a tailored suit undoubtedly paid for by our father, reeking of expensive bourbon and unearned arrogance. He took a drag of his cigarette, turned his head to exhale the smoke, and his eyes locked directly onto me. For a second, he just stared. Then a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He did not ask how his niece and nephews were doing. He did not ask how I was surviving the divorce. He looked me up and down, taking in the mud on my boots and the bright neon yellow of my safety vest. "Look at this," Brandon sneered, taking a step closer. "Mom told me you were desperate for cash after Ryan kicked you out, but I did not think you were actually out here wearing construction gear like a common-day laborer." I kept my face completely neutral, my grip tightening on my tablet. "I am conducting a municipal zoning survey, Brandon. It is called having a highly specialized career. You should try getting one instead of living off dad credit cards." Brandon laughed, shaking his head as he blew smoke into the freezing air. "You just never learned, do you, Natalie? You always had to do things the hard way, just to prove a point. Remember when Dad bought me that brand new sports car for my college graduation, and you were taking night shifts, scrubbing floors at your campus job, just to pay for your drafting software? You refused to fit into our world, and now look at you. You are a divorced, homeless outcast standing on the street while we are inside celebrating a billion-dollar empire." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and casually let it flutter to the wet, freezing pavement right at my feet. "Buy some actual food for your kids, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Jamal is hosting the mayor in exactly 20 minutes to toast the groundbreaking of the Emerald Lake project. Having you standing on the sidewalk looking this pathetic makes the whole family lose face. Take the garbage money, clean yourself up, and get off this block before you embarrass us in front of the press." He turned his back on me, tossing his cigarette into the street, before pushing the heavy brass doors open to rejoin the warm, luxurious celebration inside. I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the wet concrete. A year ago, the sheer humiliation of this moment would have crushed my spirit. I would have felt the familiar, suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat, the eternal disappointment. But tonight, standing in the cold, I felt absolutely nothing but a sudden, electrifying surge of professional clarity. Brandon had just handed me the missing piece of a massive puzzle, and he was too arrogant to even realize it. I did not bend down to pick up the money. Instead, my eyes darted rapidly between the restaurant window where Jamal was shaking hands with wealthy investors and the glowing screen of my mapping tablet. The Emerald Lake Complex. Jamal had just secured the final zoning approvals to begin excavation next month. The blueprints for his mega project were public record, and I had studied them briefly weeks ago out of pure professional curiosity. My fingers flew across the screen of my tablet. I pulled up the municipal database overlaying Jamal public development filings with the highly classified historical underground utility grid I was currently auditing for the city. Urban planning is not just about designing pretty parks. It is about understanding the invisible veins of a city, the water mains, the high-voltage electrical lines, the deep fiber optic cables that make a modern skyscraper function. I zoomed in on the exact geographical coordinates of the Emerald Lake footprint. Jamal's development team had purchased 3 entire city blocks to build his luxury towers. It was a flawless acquisition strategy, except for one incredibly tiny, seemingly insignificant detail. I held my breath as the historical grid loaded over his modern blueprint. Jamal's proposed complex required a massive centralized subterranean utility corridor to connect the new towers to the main Chicago power and water grid. I traced the colored lines on my screen. The entire corridor had to funnel through one specific geographical choke point at the southern edge of the property. I checked the county property registry. Jamal's firm had bought all the surrounding commercial lots, but they had completely missed a microscopic 50-square-meter orphaned lot right in the dead center of that utility choke point. It was an abandoned sliver of land, a remnant of a forgotten street widening project from the 1970s currently owned by an elderly woman living in a nursing home. It was a keystone property, a holdout parcel. Without full ownership or a legal easement through that exact 50-square-meter strip of dirt, Jamal had zero access to the city main utility grid. The city council would absolutely deny his final excavation permits. His engineers could not lay a single water pipe. They could not connect a single electrical transformer. The entire $1 billion Emerald Lake complex, the project that my parents had poured their entire retirement fund into, had a fatal blind spot. It was completely paralyzed, and Jamal's arrogant development team had no idea. I slowly lowered my tablet. I looked through the glass window of the restaurant. Jamal was smiling, raising his glass to my mother, who was beaming with pride. They thought they were untouchable. They thought wealth and cruelty made them invincible. I lifted my heavy mud-caked work boot and stepped directly onto Brandon's $100 bill, grinding it into the wet pavement. I did not need their pity money. I did not need their approval. I just needed my laptop and a fast, quiet real estate attorney. I turned away from the restaurant and walked into the freezing Chicago night, a cold, calculated smile finally breaking across my face. They wanted to treat me like a minor inconvenience. I was about to become the most expensive roadblock in their entire lives. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the cheap laminate kitchen table in my cramped rental apartment, the only light coming from the harsh glow of my laptop screen. In the next room, my 3 children were breathing softly, finally safe and warm. I pulled a worn fleece blanket over my shoulders and pulled up the Cook County Assessor database. Jamal was a shark, but he was a corporate shark. Men like my brother-in-law relied on expensive land acquisition software and armies of junior analysts who merely skimmed digital records. They looked at the world from the top down, seeing only air rights, luxury penthouses, and glass facades. But as a commercial landscape architect who handled municipal infrastructure, I looked at the world from the bottom up. I knew that a skyscraper was only as strong as the hidden arteries keeping it alive. I pulled up the exact geographical footprint of the Emerald Lake complex. Jamal had spent tens of millions quietly buying up 3 contiguous commercial blocks. His automated software had assembled the parcels perfectly, creating a massive unbroken rectangle of prime real estate. But the software had made a fatal assumption. It had flagged a microscopic strip of land at the southern perimeter as a municipal utility easement. It assumed the city owned it. I manually cross-referenced the parcel with historical zoning maps from the 1970s. My heart hammered against my ribs as the original hand-drawn ink maps loaded onto my screen. It was not a city easement. It was an orphaned lot. Back in 1978, the city had abandoned a proposed alleyway widening project. A clerical error in the zoning department left a tiny 50-square-meter strip of dirt, completely unrecorded in the modern digital registry. A man named Arthur Higgins had purchased it at a tax auction in 1982 for a few $100s, likely thinking he could lease it to the neighboring businesses for parking. He passed away, leaving the useless strip of dirt to his widow. Jamal did not need the air rights to that 50-square-meter lot. He needed the subsurface rights. To power a $1 billion complex, you need massive industrial-grade water mains and high-voltage electrical conduits. The surrounding area was solid bedrock and existing city subway infrastructure. Jamal engineers had precisely one geographical path to connect the Emerald Lake complex to the main Chicago utility grid. Every single pipe and wire had to run directly under Mrs. Higgins' tiny forgotten strip of dirt. Without that land, Jamal could not flush a single toilet or turn on a single light bulb in his billion-dollar empire. The city would absolutely deny his excavation permits. His entire project was a massive luxury car without an engine, and I was staring at the only set of keys. I checked my bank account. Ryan had been forced by the judge to deposit $75,000 for emergency child support and living expenses. It was our lifeline. It was the money meant to keep a roof over my kids' heads and food on our table while the divorce dragged on. Using it meant risking absolute ruin. If I made a mistake, Ryan would easily prove to the judge that I was financially reckless. He would take Leo, Mia, and Sam away from me forever. I walked into the bedroom and looked at my children sleeping peacefully. I thought about my father shutting the door in their freezing faces. I thought about Brandon throwing a $100 bill at my feet like I was garbage. I walked back to my laptop. I was not going to be a victim anymore. I was going to be a predator. I needed more capital to make an undeniable cash offer. I contacted a specialized commercial lender I knew from my city projects. I put up every piece of heavy surveying equipment I owned and took out a high-interest personal loan to secure an additional $50,000. I now had exactly $125,000 in liquid cash. By dawn, I was on the phone with a registered agent service in Wyoming. For a few $100s, I established a blind LLC. Wyoming laws allow for complete corporate anonymity. No public records would ever show my name. I called the company Obsidian Subsurface Holdings. To Jamal and his lawyers, the buyer would look like a faceless corporate entity from out of state. At 9 in the morning, I tracked down Mrs. Higgins's grandson, a tired-looking middle school teacher named David, who held her power of attorney. I called him and asked for an immediate in-person meeting at a coffee shop near his school. When I sat down across from David, I did not wear my professional suits. I wore a plain sweater and jeans. I introduced myself as an independent land scout looking to acquire small properties for a private environmental portfolio. "I understand your grandmother owns a 50-square-meter plot on West Elm," I said, keeping my voice entirely conversational. "I know it is virtually unbuildable and accrues annual property taxes. My client is willing to take it off your hands today for $120,000 in cash. We pay all closing costs, no inspections, no contingencies." David nearly choked on his coffee. He stared at me like I had lost my mind. That strip of dirt has been a headache for our family for decades, he admitted, wiping his mouth. We cannot even park a car on it because of the zoning restrictions. I have been paying the property taxes out of my own pocket just to keep the city off our backs. You really want to give me 120 grand for it? I slid a certified cashier check across the table. We can sign the transfer documents at a title company right now. We rushed to a local title office. I paid an exorbitant premium for an expedited closing and immediate recording at the county clerk office. I sat in the waiting room, my foot tapping frantically against the floor. Every time the door opened, I expected one of Jamal's slick corporate lawyers to walk in, having finally realized the catastrophic error in their blueprints. Every second felt like an hour. I was gambling my children's survival on a sliver of Chicago dirt. Finally, the title agent walked out and handed me a thick manila envelope. The deed was recorded. The transaction was legally binding. Obsidian Subsurface Holdings now owned the absolute center of Jamal billion-dollar development. I walked out of the title office and stood on the sidewalk. The cold wind hit my face, but I felt a heat radiating from my chest that I had never experienced before. Absolute, unadulterated power. I held the deed in my hands. Jamal was currently taking out massive high-interest construction loans to fund his project. Every day his site sat idle, he would bleed hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest alone. I held his financial life in a cheap manila folder. Just as I unlocked my car door, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my mother. I read the words slowly, my jaw locking into place. Natalie, your father and I are finalizing the guest list for Thanksgiving dinner next week. Do not show your face here. Jamal is inviting the mayor and several prominent city aldermen to celebrate the Emerald Lake groundbreaking. We are hosting a flawless high society evening. We do not want a failed, bitter single mother showing up in cheap clothes to ruin the lineup and make Jamal look bad in front of his political connections. Stay in whatever apartment you are renting and focus on fixing your disaster of a life. I stared at the glowing screen. A dark, genuine laugh escaped my throat. They were so busy protecting their precious image that they could not see the wrecking ball swinging directly toward their glass house. They wanted to protect Jamal and his massive project from their failure of a daughter. I typed a reply, my thumbs flying across the screen. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, Mom. I hope Jamal enjoys his celebration. Things are about to get very interesting for him. I hit send, tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. They did not want me at their dinner table. That was perfectly fine. I was going to starve them all. I returned to the cramped two-bedroom apartment the emergency support funds had secured just as the sun was beginning to rise. The faint smell of bleach and old radiator heat filled the narrow hallway, a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury I had left behind in my previous life. I took off my mud-caked work boots and checked on Leo, Mia, and Sam. They were sleeping soundly in the small second bedroom, their breathing slow and steady. I stood in the doorway for a long moment watching them. Everything I was doing, every calculated move I was making, was to ensure they would never have to rely on the hollow charity of my family ever again. The next morning, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted our breakfast routine. I opened it to find a courier struggling to hold a massive, pristine white cardboard box bearing the logo of a high-end Chicago boutique. I signed for it, feeling a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The return address was listed simply as Vanessa and Jamal. I dragged the heavy box into the living room and sliced through the thick packing tape. Instantly, the cloying, expensive scent of Vanessa custom perfume wafted out, filling my small apartment. I pulled back the tissue paper and stared at the contents. It was not a care package. It was a carefully curated collection of insults. Inside were Vanessa designer cast-offs. I pulled out a cashmere sweater with a glaring wine stain down the front, a pair of scuffed Gucci loafers that were 2 sizes too small for me, and an outdated Prada handbag with a completely busted zipper. At the bottom of the box rested a crisp white envelope. Inside was a check made out to me for exactly $500, accompanied by a handwritten note on Vanessa heavy embossed stationery. I read the elegant looping handwriting. Natalie, I convinced Jamal's assistant to box up some of my old things. Sell them or wear them, I do not care. There is a check in the envelope. Buy the kids some decent coats so they do not look like charity cases the next time you drag them out in public. Take the hint. Stay away from mom and dad and stop embarrassing this family. I dropped the note onto the cheap laminate table. Vanessa had been playing this exact psychological game since we were teenagers. She used to hand me her worn-out clothes in high school, loudly announcing her generosity in front of my parents, only to whisper later that the dresses always looked better on her anyway. My parents would praise her charitable heart while telling me I should be grateful my sister was looking out for me. She expected me to open this box, feel the crushing weight of my own inadequacy, cash her pathetic check out of desperation, and quietly disappear into the background. I looked at the broken Prada bag. I looked at the stained sweater. A cold, genuine laugh escaped my lips. She really thought $500 and a box of garbage would put me in my place. I did not throw the clothes away. I did not rip up the check. The urban planner in me saw raw materials just waiting to be repurposed. If Vanessa wanted to play dirty, I was going to take her little charity project and turn it into a weapon. I walked into my bedroom and grabbed a heavy-duty shipping box from my closet. I carefully folded the stained cashmere, the scuffed loafers, and the broken handbag, placing them inside. Then I took the $500 check and endorsed the back. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a thick black marker, and flipped Vanessa heavy stationery over to the blank side. I thought about Ryan. I thought about the red designer heels I had seen kicked off in my hallway. I thought about the junior analyst who had confidently climbed into my marital bed, knowing full well that Ryan was a married man with 3 young children. I uncapped the marker and wrote in large, unmistakable block letters, "I heard you have expensive taste, but a very cheap moral compass. Here are some hand-me-downs for your upcoming bastard child. Use the $500 to buy a conscience." I tossed the note and the endorsed check on top of the clothes and sealed the box with thick layers of packing tape. I printed a fresh shipping label specifically addressing it to the junior analyst care of Ryan, prestigious financial firm in the downtown loop. I drove to the shipping center and paid double for a guaranteed signature required delivery. I explicitly instructed the courier to deliver it directly to her desk on the main trading floor right at noon, when the open plan office would be packed with executives, brokers, and gossiping interns returning from lunch. I drove back to my apartment, made myself a cup of black coffee, and sat by the window. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 3 hours later, my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Ryan's name flashed aggressively across the screen. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow sip of my coffee before finally pressing answer. "Are you completely insane?" Ryan screamed into the receiver, his voice echoing so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You are a psychotic, bitter woman." I kept my voice soft, entirely conversational. "Hello, Ryan. How is your day going?" "Do not play games with me," he roared, the panic and rage radiating through the speaker. A courier just dropped a massive box on her desk in the middle of the trading floor. Everyone was watching. She opened it thinking it was a gift from a client. "Half the senior partners read that note you sent." She ran out of the building sobbing, and HR just called me into a meeting to discuss inappropriate workplace relationships. "You deliberately humiliated her in front of the entire firm." I took another sip of my coffee. "I just thought she might need some maternity clothes, Ryan. Since you drained my bank accounts, I assumed finances were tight. I was simply passing along some family charity. Vanessa would be thrilled to know her old Prada bag found a good home." "You think this is funny?" He spat, his breathing heavy and erratic. "You think playing these vindictive little games makes you a winner? I am calling my lawyers right now. I am going to drag you back into family court. I am going to tell the judge you are harassing my colleagues and behaving erratically. I will bury you in legal fees until you are out on the street, Natalie. I will make sure you do not get a single dime from the house or my investments. You are going to regret ever crossing me." He was breathing hard, waiting for me to crack, waiting for the hysterical emotional response he was so used to getting from the women in his life. He wanted me to yell back so he could feel justified in his cruelty. I let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch over the phone line. I listened to his ragged breathing, letting him stew in his own rising panic. When I finally spoke, my voice was razor sharp and freezing cold. You should really worry about your chief financial officer chair. Ryan, I said quietly. What are you talking about? He snapped, his voice faltering slightly. I looked down at the forensic accounting files my friend Megan had compiled, the exact files that proved he had been siphoning marital funds into offshore accounts. Did you really think the judge was going to ignore the fact that a senior finance executive was illegally hiding assets through a Delaware shell corporation? I asked, letting every word land with brutal precision. The family court reported the discrepancy. The internal audit started working today. The line went completely dead. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator. Ryan was currently hyperventilating in a glass corner office downtown, watching his entire career evaporate. But Ryan was merely a skirmish. The real war was brewing across town at the Emerald Lake complex. Jamal had hosted his spectacular groundbreaking ceremony just as my parents had boasted. The mayor had smiled for the cameras, golden shovels had pierced the topsoil, and champagne had flowed freely. But public relations stunts do not dig trenches. Actual construction requires permits, and permits require clear, indisputable title to every inch of utility access. Exactly 4 days after their glittering party, Jamal's massive fleet of excavators and bulldozers rolled onto the site. They prepared to break the bedrock for the central subterranean utility corridor. That was when a junior municipal surveyor flagged a hard stop on the city grid. The zoning department absolutely refused to issue the final excavation permit. The 50-square-meter Keystone lot blocking the entire infrastructure web was no longer an abandoned orphan property. It belonged to Obsidian Subsurface Holdings, LLC. The panic inside Jamal development firm must have been absolute chaos. In commercial real estate, time is not just money. Time is survival. Jamal had secured a $1 billion project using heavily leveraged, short-term mezzanine construction loans. These loans came with predatory interest rates and aggressive maturity dates. Every single day, his excavator sat parked in the mud. The interest payments alone cost his firm upwards of $150,000. He was bleeding cash before a single steel beam had been erected. Within 48 hours, his lead acquisition attorney tracked down the registered agent for Obsidian Subsurface Holdings. My dedicated burner phone set up specifically for this corporate entity rang while I was helping Mia and Leo with their math homework at the kitchen table. I stepped into my bedroom, closed the door, and answered using my sharpest, most sterile professional voice. I introduced myself simply as the external legal liaison for Obsidian. The man on the other end of the line was frantic, practically tripping over his expensive legal jargon to mask his absolute desperation. He offered a ridiculous, convoluted excuse about a minor boundary adjustment oversight. He then casually offered me $300,000 to sign over the deed by the end of the business day. I looked out my bedroom window at the Chicago skyline. I told him Obsidian was currently evaluating long-term environmental conservation uses for the property, and we were not entertaining external offers at this time. I hung up before he could form an argument. The offers did not stop. They escalated with terrifying speed, reflecting Jamal's rapidly deteriorating financial reality. By the end of the week, the number jumped to $500,000. The attorney called back, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, demanding a face-to-face meeting. I calmly informed him that my client preferred digital correspondence and disconnected the call. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived at my Wyoming registered agent, offering a flat $1 million in an expedited cash transfer. I rejected every single advance with a standard 2-sentence email citing portfolio retention strategies. I was actively boxing Jamal into a corner he could not buy his way out of. He could not redesign a billion-dollar utility grid retroactively. The engineering geometry of the surrounding bedrock and the existing subway tunnels made bypassing my tiny lot a physical impossibility. He was trapped, and his high-interest loans were ticking like a bomb. A few days later, I deliberately drove past the Emerald Lake site on my way to drop Leo and Mia at school. The contrast to their glamorous groundbreaking was staggering. The massive chain-link gates were heavily padlocked. The yellow bulldozers sat silent, gathering a layer of frost. The site was completely dead. Rumors were already starting to circulate in the Chicago business journals about unexplained delays and severe permitting nightmares at the city's most anticipated development. Investors were getting incredibly nervous, and the financial sharks were starting to circle the bleeding project. That financial paralysis did not just threaten Jamal and Vanessa. It threatened the very foundation of my parents' arrogant existence. Richard and Eleanor had always worshipped wealth, and Jamal had promised them an astronomical return on their investment. To secure their elite spot in his inner circle, my parents had liquidated their entire retirement portfolio. They had taken out a massive secondary mortgage on their pristine suburban estate to pour every available dollar of their liquidity into the Emerald Lake Seed Fund. They were completely overleveraged, believing the project was a guaranteed success. That evening, I was reviewing a new municipal contract when my personal phone buzzed. It was an incoming call from my brother Brandon. I let it go to voicemail, but a text message immediately followed. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad? Dad is pacing a hole in the floor, and Mom is crying in the kitchen." Jamal stopped returning their calls 2 days ago. The construction site is shut down, and the bank just flagged Dad bridge loan. They are saying the project is frozen because some anonymous hedge fund is holding the utility rights hostage and refusing to negotiate. If Jamal defaults on his construction loans, the bank is going to seize Mom and Dad house. I read the message twice, letting the sweet reality of the situation wash over me. The Golden family, the people who had locked me out in the freezing rain and told me to figure out how to live under a bridge, were now staring directly down the barrel of their own homelessness. They had bet their entire empire on Jamal, and Jamal had just hit an impenetrable brick wall named Natalie. But building a brick wall is expensive. Maintaining Obsidian's subsurface holdings required capital. My registered agent in Wyoming needed to be paid. The specialized commercial real estate attorney I had placed on retainer to handle Jamal, frantic inquiries required a massive upfront fee. I also had to feed, clothe, and shelter 3 growing children in a city that practically charged you just to breathe the winter air. The heavy equipment loan I took out to buy the Keystone lot required its first aggressive monthly payment in exactly 9 days. I was the master of the board, but I was rapidly running out of oxygen. I needed liquidity, and I needed it immediately. I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a notepad. I had one remaining safety net. When I was 10 years old, my paternal grandmother passed away. She was the only person in the Wilson family who ever saw me as an individual rather than a prop. Before she died, she established a private trust fund in my name. The stipulations were strict. The money was locked away to accrue interest and was designed to be released to me either for a down payment on a first home or when I hit a specific age milestone. I had never touched it. Throughout the grueling years of my marriage to Ryan, I had viewed that money as an untouchable shield for my children. I wanted to save it for their college tuition or an absolute life-altering emergency. This qualified as the emergency of a lifetime. The next morning, after dropping the kids at school, I drove to the massive steel and glass headquarters of the downtown financial institution that my grandmother trusts. I wore my best professional suit, a remnant from my old life, and carried my leather briefcase. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from a senior wealth manager named David. He typed my social security number and the legacy account details into his terminal. I politely asked for the paperwork to authorize a $50,000 disbursement. David frowned. He adjusted his glasses and typed the numbers in again. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion as he stared at the glowing monitor. "Mrs. Henderson," he began, his voice taking on a distinctly uncomfortable edge. "I am looking at the portfolio history. This account was fully liquidated and closed out over 3 years ago." The air in the sterile office seemed to instantly vanish. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the impossible sentence he had just spoken. I told him there had to be a clerical error. I explained that I had never initiated a withdrawal, let alone liquidated the entire account. The principal balance alone had been over $250,000. David turned his monitor toward me. The digital ledger was entirely flat. The balance read 0. He pulled up the archival transfer documents. Because the account had originally been established when I was a minor, my father Richard had been listed as the primary custodian. However, the legal stipulations of the trust clearly mandated that once I reached the age of majority, any withdrawal required my direct physical signature alongside the custodian approval. David printed the final withdrawal authorization form from their digital archives and slid it across the mahogany desk. I looked down at the paper. There, sitting right next to my father's aggressive, unmistakable scrawl, was my name. I stared at the blue ink. It was an incredibly confident forgery, but it was still a forgery. The loop on the N was entirely wrong. The slant of the letters leaned heavily to the right. It was a perfect imitation of how my father thought I signed my name, executed by a man who had never paid enough attention to his own daughter to realize she was left-handed. My mind raced back exactly 3 years. 3 years ago, my parents had suddenly decided to completely gut and renovate their pristine suburban estate. They imported custom Italian marble for the kitchen, installed a massive outdoor entertaining pavilion, and bought Vanessa a brand new Range Rover for her birthday. When I had asked my mother how they afforded such a massive lifestyle upgrade, she had smugly claimed my father had closed a brilliant investment deal. There was no brilliant investment deal. They had stolen my grandmother's final gift to me. They had literally ripped the financial security away from their own grandchildren to pay for imported countertops and a luxury vehicle for their golden child. Richard had walked into a bank, forged his own daughter's signature, and walked out with $250,000. He did it because he viewed me as weak. He assumed I was too compliant, too passive, and too desperate for family approval to ever audit my own trust fund. "This is not your signature," David asked softly, studying my rigid expression. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "It is not." David reached for his desk phone. "I need to call our fraud department immediately. We have to contact federal authorities. A forged wire transfer of this magnitude is a severe felony. Your father could face serious prison time." My hand shot out, covering the receiver before he could lift it. "Do not call anyone," I commanded. David looked at me in shock. "Mrs. Henderson, the bank is legally obligated to report this. You are the victim of a massive financial crime." "I know exactly what I am," I replied, locking eyes with him. "But if you call the police right now, this becomes a chaotic, bureaucratic investigation. My father will hire a team of vicious corporate defense attorneys. They will tie this up in litigation for years. They will claim I gave verbal consent. They will drag my name through the mud. I do not want an investigation. I want leverage." I leaned across the desk, tapping my finger against the forged document. "I want you to pull every single piece of data associated with this transaction. I want the original withdrawal slips. I want the routing numbers for the receiving accounts. I want the exact timestamps and the names of the tellers who processed the transfer. I want everything printed, certified, and officially notarized by your bank fraud department, proving that this specific signature is fraudulent." David hesitated, the institutional protocol fighting against the absolute certainty in my voice. "If you want to protect your bank from liability for failing to verify a forged signature on a $250,000 transfer, you will do exactly what I ask," I stated flatly. "Give me the weapon. I will pull the trigger myself." 2 hours later, I walked out of the towering glass building holding a thick, sealed envelope. The weight of it in my hands felt like holding a live grenade. The certified documents inside were indisputable. They detailed a direct, unassailable trail of wire fraud leading straight from my trust fund into my father's primary checking account. Richard and Eleanor thought they were untouchable. They thought their wealth and social standing insulated them from consequences. They had spent my entire life stealing my confidence, stealing my peace, and finally stealing my financial future. Now they were begging Jamal to save them from a real estate disaster they did not even realize I had orchestrated. I opened my car door and tossed the heavy envelope onto the passenger seat. Just as I started the engine, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my mother. I read the words on the screen, a cold, dark humor washing over me. "Natalie, your brother tells me you are struggling with your rent. Come to the house this afternoon. I will give you $1,000 to help you feed the kids. Please try to look presentable and do not park your cheap car in the main driveway. We are stressed enough about the Jamal project without having to deal with your drama. They had stolen $250,000 from me, and she was offering me $1,000 of my own money like it was an act of profound grace. They wanted me to grovel. They wanted me to walk through their front door, head bowed, grateful for the crumbs falling from their table. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the text message. My parents had built their entire identity on looking down at me. It was time to force them to look up. I typed my reply, keeping it brief. I will be there at 3. Time to collect a debt. I dropped the phone into the cup holder, shifted the car into drive, and pulled out into the Chicago traffic. I was not going to their house to beg for rent money. I was going to hand them a certified notarized felony indictment. I pulled my beat-up sedan into the sprawling circular driveway of my parents' suburban estate. It was wedged between Brandon's brand-new sports car and Jamal's blacked-out luxury SUV. I walked up the custom stone pathway, the exact same stone paid for by my stolen inheritance, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door without knocking. The house smelled of expensive catering and suffocating tension. I walked straight down the hallway and into the formal dining room. They were all there. My father, Richard, was pouring a glass of bourbon. My mother, Eleanor, was arranging artisan appetizers on a silver platter. Vanessa and Jamal sat at the massive oak table. Jamal looked terrible. He was sweating aggressively, tapping his foot and staring blankly at a laptop screen. Brandon was leaning against the marble kitchen island, wearing a smirk and a tailored shirt, holding a crystal glass of champagne. It was his 29th birthday, but the mood in the room felt closer to a funeral. Eleanor's head snapped up as I entered, her perfectly manicured face contorted with immediate irritation. She wiped her hands on a linen towel and marched over to her designer handbag resting on the credenza. "I specifically told you to park on the street," Eleanor hissed, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the men. She pulled out a pristine white envelope and tossed it onto the edge of the dining table. It landed with a soft, insulting thud. "There is $1,000 in cash inside. Take it and go back to your apartment. We are in the middle of a massive crisis with the Jamal project, and we are trying to salvage Brandon's birthday dinner. We do not have the time or the patience for your manufactured drama today." I stopped at the edge of the table. I looked at the white envelope, then up at my mother. I did not reach for the money. "I am not here for your handouts, Eleanor," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the room. The absolute calm in my tone made Richard pause his pouring. Brandon scoffed, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "Then what do you want?" Natalie Brandon sneered. "Did you come to beg Jamal for a job cleaning up his construction site? You are wearing out your welcome. Grab the cash and leave before you ruin my birthday." I ignored my brother completely. My eyes locked directly onto my father. He stood by the bar cart, the crystal decanter frozen in his hand. He looked exactly like the man who had shut the door in my face when my children were freezing, arrogant, insulated, and entirely convinced of his own supremacy. "Where is my grandmother's trust fund, Richard?" I asked. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's hand froze over her appetizer tray. Vanessa looked up from her phone. Jamal finally stopped tapping his foot. Richard slowly set the decanter down. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a familiar explosive rage. His jaw tightened as he took a step toward me. "I do not know what you are talking about," he barked, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You are not going to march into my house on your brother's birthday and start making psychotic accusations." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, sealed envelope I had secured from the bank manager just hours earlier. I slapped it down onto the oak table right next to Eleanor's pathetic $1,000 handout. "It is certified documentation from the Downtown Wealth Management Branch," I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "It contains the original withdrawal slips, the routing numbers, and a notarized affidavit from their fraud department, confirming that you forged my signature 3 years ago. You liquidated $250,000 of my inheritance to pay for this kitchen renovation and Brandon's sports car." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Brandon's smirk vanished instantly. You stole from your own grandchildren while they were sleeping in a freezing apartment. I continued, stepping closer to my father. You watched me struggle to buy groceries, knowing full well you had stolen my financial security to fund your country club lifestyle. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The cornered animal inside him lashed out. He slammed his fist down on the bar cart, making the glasses rattle. I raised you, he roared, the veins in his neck bulging. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars clothing you, feeding you, and paying for your ungrateful existence. I took back what was rightfully mine. You refused to fall in line, you ruined a perfect marriage with Ryan, and you dragged our family name through the mud. You owed me that money. He took another step toward me, towering over my frame, trying to use the physical intimidation that had always worked when I was a child. But I was not a child anymore. I did not take a single step back. And what exactly are you going to do about it, Natalie? Richard sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. You are a broke, divorced single mother with no power and no influence. You think anyone is going to take your word against mine in this city? You think you can afford the legal fees to fight me? Are you really going to call the police and sue your own flesh and blood? I looked at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation. The man I had feared for 35 years was nothing but a fragile, desperate thief. I slowly shook my head. A cold, precise smile formed on my lips. No, Richard, I said softly. I am not going to sue you. I am not going to waste years of my life fighting you in civil court for money you have already spent. Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, looking over at Jamal and Brandon as if he had just won the battle. You see, he mocked. She is all talk. She knows she cannot touch us. I waited for his laugh to echo through the dining room before I delivered the final fatal blow. I am not suing you because I do not have to. I continued, my voice slicing through his arrogant laughter. While you were busy stealing my trust fund, you got sloppy. You moved that $250,000 directly through the family company commercial accounts to avoid personal capital gains taxes. You logged it as a corporate loss. Richard's laughter abruptly stopped. All the color instantly drained from his face. He looked as if all the oxygen had just been sucked out of his lungs. When I requested the certified bank records this morning, I noticed the routing numbers belonged to the Wilson Manufacturing corporate entity, I explained, watching his eyes widen in pure terror. So I took all of your banking data, combined it with the financial ledgers Ryan had carelessly left on his home laptop during our marriage, and I handed the entire package over to a federal agent. Eleanor dropped her silver platter. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, scattering artisan cheese everywhere. I did not call the local police, Richard. I filed a massive, fully documented complaint with the Internal Revenue Service for corporate tax evasion and felony wire fraud. I turned my back on my father and looked at Brandon, who was now clutching the kitchen island with white knuckles. Happy 29th birthday, Brandon, I said cheerfully. Enjoy the expensive cake. Tomorrow morning, federal auditors are going to knock on that custom mahogany front door, and they will freeze every single asset this family owns. I picked up my leather briefcase, stepped over the mess my mother had dropped, and walked toward the exit. I did not look back as the screams and absolute panic finally erupted behind me. The screams from the dining room faded the moment the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me. The crisp evening air felt cleaner than it had in years. I got into my car, hands trembling slightly from the sheer adrenaline, and started the engine. The IRS audit would dismantle my parents' fraudulent empire brick by brick, but the main event was still waiting on the main stage. For the next 48 hours, my life returned to a deceptive calm. I made breakfast for Mia and Leo, helped them with their science projects, and attended a parent-teacher conference. But beneath the mundane routine, a countdown clock was ticking. Jamal was running out of time. The mezzanine lenders were undoubtedly circling his firm, like sharks smelling blood in the water. It happened on Thursday afternoon. The dedicated burner phone locked in my desk drawer began to violently buzz. I stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a private number, but I knew exactly who it was. The municipal freeze on the Emerald Lake project had reached critical mass. Jamal was bleeding cash, and desperate men always try to bypass the gatekeepers. I opened the top drawer of my desk and retrieved the external voice modulation hardware I had purchased weeks ago. I plugged it into the burner phone and engaged the encryption protocol. I cleared my throat, tested the audio feed to ensure my voice registered as a deep, resonant, and entirely unidentifiable male baritone, and swiped to answer. Obsidian Holdings. I answered the digital modulator, rendering my voice perfectly sterile and corporate. "Listen to me very carefully, whoever you are," the voice on the other end snarled. It was Jamal. His usual smooth, charismatic public relations tone was completely gone, replaced by the frantic aggression of a man watching his billion-dollar empire circle the drain. "I am done playing games with your proxy lawyers and your automated emails. I am Jamal Crawford. I am the principal developer of the Emerald Lake Complex, and you are currently trespassing on my timeline." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. "Your timeline is not my concern, Mr. Crawford. My firm legally acquired an orphaned utility keystone. Your failure to properly survey the subterranean grid before breaking ground is a reflection of your incompetence, not our liability." Jamal let out a sharp, breathless laugh, a sound bordering on hysteria. "Do not give me that corporate leverage nonsense. We both know exactly what this is. You bought a worthless 50-square-meter slab of bedrock specifically to extort me. You are a parasite looking for a quick payday. Fine. You win. I am holding a cashier check for $2 million. Sell that plot immediately. Sign over the deed today." $2 million. It was a staggering amount of money. It was enough to pay off my house, secure my children's college funds, and completely insulate us from any financial worry for the next decade. For a fraction of a second, the exhausted single mother inside me screamed to take the deal and walk away. But taking his money would let him win. It would allow Jamal and Vanessa to continue their reign of arrogant destruction. They would step over me and keep climbing. I did not want a settlement. I wanted an execution. I tapped my fingernail against the wooden desk. $2 million is an insult, Mr. Crawford. Your daily interest payments alone are burning through that amount every 2 weeks. You are severely overleveraged. Your investors are pulling out. If you default on your construction loans, your firm goes bankrupt, and your personal assets will be liquidated. How the hell do you know about my loans? Jamal demanded, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. "I know everything about your sinking ship," I replied smoothly through the modulator. "And because I know exactly how desperate you are, the price to unfreeze your grid just went up. I want $10 million. $10 million. Jamal screamed the words into the receiver. "Are you out of your mind? That is outright extortion. I will drag you through federal court. I will have you investigated for racketeering." "Then I suggest you hang up and call your legal team," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "But we both know you do not have the time for a prolonged legal battle. By the time a judge even looks at your injunction, the bank will have seized the Emerald Lake property. $10 million is the price of your survival. Take it or I will gladly watch you drown." I could hear his ragged, heavy breathing through the phone. He was trapped. He was a rat in a maze, frantically searching for an exit that did not exist. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. "Fine," he finally choked out. The words sounded like broken glass. 10 million. But I am not wiring a dime to some anonymous shell company. I want to look the man holding a gun to my head in the eye. I want a physical signature on the transfer deed. I had anticipated this demand. In fact, I was counting on it. "We can certainly arrange a formal signing," I replied. "I understand you are hosting a highly publicized pre-launch gala for the Emerald Lake project this coming Saturday." "It is supposed to be a celebration," Jamal muttered bitterly. "A charity dinner for the investors. Not that there is anything left to celebrate." "There will be," I assured him. "I will have my principal representative attend the gala in person. Bring the contract. Bring your attorneys. My representative will sign the deed over to your firm right there in the ballroom, and you will initiate the $10 million wire transfer in their presence. Jamal hesitated. You are going to sign it at my gala. Why? Because Obsidian Holdings appreciates a sense of occasion, I said. Have the paperwork ready, Mr. Crawford. We will see you on Saturday. I disconnected the call before he could ask another question. I unplugged the modulator, my hands shaking not from fear but from the sheer, unadulterated thrill of the trap snapping shut. Jamal had just agreed to hand over $10 million to his own sister-in-law. Later that evening, while the kids were doing their homework, I opened my laptop and pulled up Vanessa's social media pages. I knew my sister better than anyone. She was entirely incapable of keeping a secret, especially when she thought she had won. Sure enough, a new post had just gone live on her profile. It featured a professionally staged photograph of her and Jamal standing in front of the padlocked Emerald Lake construction gates, both of them wearing triumphant designer-clad smiles. The caption read, "Minor setbacks are just stepping stones for visionaries." Jamal just successfully negotiated the final bureaucratic hurdle with a rival firm. We absolutely crushed the obstacle. The garbage blocking our path has been permanently cleared out. Get ready, Chicago. This Saturday night, our pre-launch gala is going to make history. I stared at the glowing screen, reading her arrogant words over and over again. Vanessa honestly believed they had bullied an anonymous hedge fund into submission. She believed Jamal had aggressively negotiated a victory. She thought she was preparing for a night of glittering triumph where she would be crowned the queen of Chicago real estate. She was right about one thing. Saturday night was absolutely going to make history. I closed the laptop and walked into my bedroom. I opened the closet and looked at the garment bag hanging in the back. Inside was the most expensive, devastatingly beautiful evening gown I had ever purchased. I had bought it weeks ago, anticipating this exact moment. I was not going to show up to their gala as the broken, discarded sister they had thrown out into the cold. I was going to walk into that ballroom as the sole owner of Obsidian Subsurface Holdings, and I was going to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. That night, I did not waste another second thinking about Ryan, my parents, or Vanessa's threats. Ryan's career was already collapsing under the weight of his own financial crimes. My parents were already trapped inside the IRS audit they had earned. Jamal had already agreed to walk onto a public stage and hand me the perfect opportunity to destroy him. All I had to do now was wait for morning. The gala was 24 hours away, and every person who had ever called me weak was about to gather in the same ballroom. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor. I had just poured my first cup of coffee and was watching the steam rise when my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the granite countertop. The caller ID flashed a picture of Vanessa smiling brightly in a designer gown. It was Saturday morning, the day of the Emerald Lake pre-launch gala. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor, and swiped to answer the call. I did not even get the chance to say hello. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Vanessa shrieked. Her voice was sharp, breathless, and vibrating with an ugly, panicked rage. I held the phone a few inches away from my ear, staring out the kitchen window at the quiet street below. "Good morning to you too, Vanessa," I replied, my tone perfectly even. "Do not play your pathetic passive-aggressive games with me, Natalie," she snapped. "Jamal just got a personal phone call from Chief Harris at the 4th Precinct. They play golf together at the club. Harris told him that your ex-husband was arrested at your apartment complex last night for breaking and entering. He said you literally set up a camera feed and had Ryan dragged out of the building in handcuffs like a common criminal. He was trying to break down my door while my children were inside," I stated simply. "He is a criminal. The handcuffs were entirely appropriate. He was probably just stressed out and wanted to see his kids." Vanessa countered, instantly defaulting to defending a man who had terrorized me simply because it allowed her to attack me. "You always provoke him. You always have to be the victim. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for our family?" Jamal is a highly respected public figure in this city. He is currently navigating a billion-dollar real estate deal. The last thing we need is the police chief calling him at dawn because his sister-in-law is causing domestic disturbances in some cheap apartment complex. The sheer audacity of her narcissism was almost breathtaking. Vanessa did not care that Ryan had threatened me. She did not care that her niece and nephew had been in potential danger. She only cared that a police chief had associated her pristine, carefully curated life with a domestic incident. She viewed my trauma as an inconvenience to her social calendar. I leaned against the counter, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. "Your social standing is truly my deepest concern right now, Vanessa," I said dryly. "You think this is funny," she snarled. "You think you can just embarrass us and face no consequences. Listen to me very carefully, Natalie. Tonight is the most important night of my life. The Emerald Lake Gala is going to feature the mayor, the city council, and every major investor in Chicago. We are celebrating a massive victory. Jamal just cleared out a pathetic squatter who was trying to block our construction grid. We won. We always win." I smiled into my coffee cup, listening to her blindly brag about the trap she was currently stepping into. "And because we won," Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with venomous authority, "Jamal and I are officially the most powerful couple in Chicago real estate. Our parents are arriving at the venue tonight, and we are going to celebrate our empire. But you are done. If you think you can continue to drag our family name through the mud with your messy, broke, pathetic existence, you are mistaken. I am drawing a line in the sand today." I took another sip of coffee. "What kind of line, Vanessa?" "I am going to make sure you are permanently banished from this city, high society," she threatened, emphasizing every syllable. "I am going to talk to every firm, every board member, and every socialite in Chicago. I will tell them you are unstable. I will tell them you are a liability. By the time I am finished networking at the gala tonight, you will not be able to get a job cleaning floors in a corporate office. You are going to be permanently blacklisted. You will be nothing." She paused, breathing heavily into the receiver, waiting for me to crack. She was waiting for the familiar sound of her older sister crying, apologizing and begging for familial mercy. She wanted me to cower. She wanted me to submit to the golden child. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. "Are you finished?" I finally asked, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm clinical register. Vanessa hesitated, clearly thrown by my absolute lack of panic. "What did you say?" she asked, her tone faltering. I said, "Are you finished throwing your little temper tantrum?" I repeated, standing up straight. "Because while you are busy planning your wardrobe and rehearsing your threats, you should probably be worrying about your husband's desperate financial reality. You should really be worrying about your status as a wealthy wife, Vanessa." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, attempting to sound arrogant, but a thin thread of doubt bled into her words. "Jamal is a titan. He is worth hundreds of millions of dollars." "Jamal is highly leveraged," I corrected her sharply. "He owns nothing but high-interest debt and predatory construction loans. And because his excavators have been parked in the mud for weeks, he is bleeding $150,000 a day in interest alone. His investors are panicking. His mezzanine lenders are preparing to seize your assets." "That is a lie," Vanessa snapped, but her voice wavered. "We solved the permitting issue. Jamal negotiated a settlement with the shell company. We bought the land." "He did not negotiate a settlement," I countered smoothly. "He begged for mercy. And he did not just buy the land, Vanessa. He agreed to an extortionate ransom of $10 million just to keep his project from going bankrupt." I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The absolute silence on her end meant my words had hit their target. "He did not tell you, did he?" I pressed, twisting the knife. "Your visionary husband did not mention where he is getting that $10 million on a Saturday afternoon. He cannot go to a legitimate bank, Vanessa. His credit lines are maxed out, and traditional lenders will not finance a ransom payment for an orphaned utility lot." "Shut up," Vanessa whispered, but she did not hang up the phone. She was paralyzed. "He is borrowing that money from shadow lenders," I stated, driving the reality directly into her fragile ego. "He is taking out predatory, unregulated loans from men tied directly to the mob. Men who do not use collection agencies or file civil lawsuits when you default on a payment. They use enforcers. Your husband is mortgaging your entire fake life. your mansion, your cars, and your future, to dangerous criminals just to buy a 50-square-meter piece of dirt. No! Vanessa stammered, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. You are lying. You are just jealous. You do not know anything about his business. I know that your perfect family is a house of cards, I replied coldly, and I know that the wind is already blowing. The line went dead quiet. I could hear Vanessa's frantic, ragged breaths as the immaculate lie of her existence began to crack from the inside out. She was married to a man who kept terrifying secrets. She was entirely dependent on a financial empire that was currently built on quicksand and mob money. And the seed of doubt I had just planted was going to consume her from the inside out. Smile for the cameras tonight, Vanessa, I said, my voice soft but deadly. Put on your expensive dress. Drink your champagne and pretend everything is fine. Enjoy the gala. I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. The golden child was currently hyperventilating in her suburban mansion, staring at the terrifying cracks in her flawless reflection. The panic had been successfully transferred. I walked back into my bedroom and looked at the garment bag hanging in the closet. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. The only thing left to do was step onto the stage and pull the lever. I was ready for the gala. The federal freeze hit my parents like a freight train on Friday morning. By noon, the reality of the IRS audit had completely paralyzed their lives. Their platinum credit cards were declined at the grocery store. Their personal banking apps displayed terrifying red error messages. The offshore accounts Richard had spent years carefully layering through shell companies were locked down tight. They were officially radioactive. Desperation breeds severe amnesia. It makes arrogant people forget their pride and run to the nearest available lifeboat. For Richard and Eleanor, that lifeboat was supposed to be Jamal. My parents pulled their luxury sedan up to the massive iron gates of Jamal and Vanessa's sprawling suburban estate. They bypassed the intercom and used the family passcode to force the gates open. They marched up the manicured walkway and let themselves into the grand foyer, expecting the usual deferential treatment from their golden son-in-law. Instead, they walked into a war zone. Jamal was pacing frantically behind his custom mahogany desk in his home office. He was sweating through his designer shirt, gripping a crystal glass of scotch so tightly his knuckles were white. Vanessa sat on the edge of a white leather sofa, her face ashen, nursing a severe migraine. She had not slept a single hour since my phone call the day before. The terrifying reality of the shadow lenders and the mob debt was eating her alive. The illusion of their invincible empire was shattering, and my parents had just stumbled right into the collateral damage. Richard did not notice the tension. He was too consumed by his own panic. He walked straight up to Jamal's desk, puffing out his chest, attempting to project his usual commanding authority. "Jamal, we have a critical situation," Richard announced, slamming his hand down on the polished wood. "We are dealing with a temporary liquidity freeze. It is a massive misunderstanding with the federal auditors. Some jealous competitor filed a bogus complaint. My lawyers are handling it, but I need an immediate injection of capital to keep the firm operations running. I need you to wire $5 million into a clean holding account by the end of the day." Jamal stopped pacing. He slowly turned his head to look at my father. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with an unfiltered venomous rage. He stared at Richard as if he were looking at a cockroach that had just crawled onto his desk. "You need $5 million, Jamal repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. "You march into my house uninvited while I am dealing with the most critical deadline of my entire career, and you demand $5 million like you are asking to borrow my lawnmower." Richard frowned, his authoritative facade faltering. "We are family, Jamal. I gave Vanessa to you. I supported your early ventures. You are sitting on a billion-dollar development project. $5 million is a drop in the bucket for you, and it will save the family legacy." Jamal let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. It was a harsh, ugly sound entirely devoid of humor. "Family legacy," Jamal sneered, stepping out from behind the desk and closing the distance between them. "You do not have a legacy, Richard. You have a sinking ship. You are a dinosaur managing a fraudulent, outdated manufacturing firm that has been hemorrhaging money for a decade. I know exactly how you run your books. I know you steal from Peter to pay Paul, and now the feds have finally caught you. Eleanor gasped, stepping forward to grab her husband's arm. Jamal, how dare you speak to your father-in-law that way? We are in the middle of a crisis. You are in a crisis! Jamal roared the sudden volume, making Eleanor flinch backward. You are a walking liability. Do you have any idea what I am dealing with right now? I have municipal regulators breathing down my neck. I have lenders threatening to seize my assets. I have an anonymous corporate entity extorting me for $10 million just to get my excavators moving again. I am fighting for my absolute survival, and you two walk in here asking for a handout. Richard's face turned a deep, mottled red. I am not asking for a handout. I am demanding respect. I am your family. You are parasites, Jamal snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father's face. You are blood-sucking leeches. You have spent years parading around country clubs pretending you are titans of industry while secretly begging me for favorable contract terms and free public relations. You are an anchor pulling my wife down. I am not giving you $5 million. I am not giving you 5 cents. Get out of my house before I have security to throw you off the property. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing in sheer disbelief. The man who had always demanded total submission was being publicly eviscerated. Eleanor turned to her golden child, her eyes wide with desperate panic. Vanessa, please, talk to him. Tell him he has to help us. If we do not get that money, the bank is going to foreclose on the house. We will lose everything. You cannot let this happen to your parents. Vanessa sat on the sofa, her hands gripping her knees. She looked at my mother, then looked at Jamal. Vanessa knew the truth. She knew about the predatory loans. She knew Jamal was cornered by dangerous men. If she sided with her parents, Jamal would turn his rage on her. She chose the only thing she truly loved. She chose her own status. She looked away, staring blankly at the floor. You need to leave, Mom. Vanessa whispered, her voice devoid of any emotion. Jamal is right. We cannot help you. We have our own problems. Eleanor let out a choked, devastated sob. The golden child had just severed the cord. My parents were entirely alone. They walked out of the mansion in absolute silence, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind them. They got into their car, the engine idling in the driveway. Richard gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly ahead, completely broken. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, tears streaming down her carefully preserved face, her manicured nails digging into her leather purse. They had no money, they had no credit, they had no powerful allies left. They had exhausted every possible option in their elite social circle, except one. Eleanor pulled her phone from her purse. Her hands were shaking violently as she scrolled through her contacts. She bypassed her wealthy friends, her country club associates, and her lawyers. She stopped on my name. The daughter she had called a failure, the daughter whose inheritance she had stolen, the daughter she had banished from her pristine life. My phone rang while I was organizing the final digital files for the IRS inspector. I looked at the caller ID. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly answered. Hello, Eleanor, I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Natalie Eleanor sobbed into the receiver, completely discarding any pretense of dignity. Natalie, thank God you answered. We are in a terrible situation. It is an absolute nightmare. The federal government has made a massive mistake. They froze our accounts. Jamal and Vanessa turned their backs on us. We have nothing left. We need your help immediately. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. That sounds like a difficult situation, Eleanor. But I am not sure why you are calling me. You made it very clear on Brandon's birthday that I was no longer welcome in your life. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical breath, seamlessly shifting from a sobbing victim into a demanding authoritarian. Do not do this to me right now, Natalie. Do not be petty. We are talking about the survival of this family. We raised you. We fed you. You owe us. I did not say a word. I let her desperate, frantic breathing fill the silence. I need you to go to your bank today, Eleanor demanded, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo. I need you to take out a maximum equity line of credit against your apartment. Use whatever collateral you have. Liquidate your retirement accounts. I will have our lawyers draft a promissory note. You have to sign the loan paperwork under your name and transfer the cash to us by tomorrow morning. You are the daughter. You have a responsibility to save your parents." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her demand was almost poetic. She had stolen $250,000 from me to fund her kitchen renovation, and now facing federal prison, she wanted me to mortgage my home to save her from the consequences of her own greed. She still viewed me as a disposable asset, an object existing solely to absorb their failures. I waited until her frantic breathing slowed down. I let the silence stretch until she was forced to confront the absolute void on the other end of the line. "Are you listening to me, Natalie?" Eleanor shrieked. "I hear you perfectly." "Eleanor," I replied, my voice slicing through the phone with surgical precision. "You want me to sign the paperwork to save your lifestyle?" "Yes," she gasped, a sudden wave of pathetic relief flooding her voice. "Yes, exactly. We will pay you back, I swear. Just sign the papers." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the city I was about to conquer. "Fine," I said, my tone completely devoid of empathy. "Bring the loan paperwork and your lawyers to Jamal pre-launch gala tomorrow night." Eleanor hesitated, clearly confused by the venue choice. "The gala? Why the gala?" "Natalie, we need to do this at the bank." "You want my signature, Eleanor?" I interrupted, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute register. "Then you will do exactly as I say. Bring the documents to the Emerald Lake Ballroom. I will be there." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I walked into my bedroom, looked at the stunning evening gown hanging in the closet, and smiled. The guests were assembling. The stage was set. The slaughter was about to begin. The heavy door of the black limousine opened. I stepped out onto the red carpet, the cool night air hitting my face. The flash of paparazzi cameras instantly illuminated the damp Chicago street, capturing my arrival without knowing my identity. I wore a custom midnight blue silk suit, perfectly tailored to armor my frame. My hair was pulled back into a sharp structural updo that left my face completely exposed. I held my black leather portfolio in one hand and walked past the velvet ropes with a measured, predatory grace. There was no hesitation in my stride. I was no longer the discarded daughter begging for scraps. I was the executioner arriving at the scaffold. I handed my coat to a bewildered attendant and stepped through the towering gilded doors of the grand ballroom. The space was a monument to Jamal's aggressive vanity. Massive ice sculptures shaped like the proposed Emerald Lake Towers dominated the room corners. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos carried silver trays stacked with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. A string quartet played a lively classical piece from a raised, illuminated stage. The room was packed with Chicago's absolute elite. I recognized city council members, the mayor, and a dozen prominent venture capitalists. And right in the center of the glittering room, standing under a massive crystal chandelier, was my family. Jamal wore a bespoke tuxedo, but the fabric looked tight across his shoulders. He was sweating aggressively, checking his diamond watch every 30 seconds, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance. Vanessa stood beside him in a sweeping gold gown, flashing her brilliant manufactured smile at a group of older investors, though her eyes were tight with suppressed panic. Richard and Eleanor were positioned a few feet away, holding their champagne flutes like shields. Brandon was leaning against a cocktail table, desperately trying to look affluent and relaxed. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. They were a family drowning in debt, terrified of IRS audits, and shadow lenders desperately pretending they were standing on solid ground. They were waiting for their savior. They were waiting for the anonymous president of Obsidian Holdings to walk through the doors and hand them their salvation. I took a breath, letting the sheer irony of the moment wash over me, and walked directly toward the center of the room. Eleanor spotted me first. Her forced smile instantly collapsed into a mask of sheer horror. The champagne flute in her hand trembled so violently she nearly spilled it on her designer shoes. She whispered something frantic to Richard, who snapped his head in my direction. His jaw dropped. Eleanor did not wait for me to reach them. She broke away from the group and marched rapidly across the marble floor, intercepting me near a towering floral arrangement. She grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging sharply into the silk sleeve of my suit. "What in the world are you doing here?" Eleanor hissed through gritted teeth, her eyes wide with frantic, suppressed rage. She looked me up and down, taking in the expensive fabric of my suit and the absolute calm on my face. "Where did you rent these clothes? Are you out of your mind? Get out of here right now before anyone sees you." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I just stared at her fingers until she felt the absolute coldness in my gaze and nervously released her grip. "Do not touch me, Eleanor," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely unbothered by her panic. "You are going to ruin everything," she whispered frantically, glancing over her shoulder to make sure the investors were not watching. "We are in the middle of a massive crisis. Jamal is trying to secure his biggest partnership, and we are trying to salvage our reputation. We do not have the time or the patience for your pathetic need for attention. You are going to humiliate us in front of Jamal's biggest partners. Leave, now." Brandon had noticed the commotion. He hurried over, his face flushed with immediate irritation. He stepped in front of me, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me, just like he had done when we were children. "I do not know how you sneaked past the door staff, Natalie," Brandon sneered, pointing a finger toward the exit. "But you need to turn around and walk right back out to the street. I am not going to let your manufactured drama ruin Jamal night. If you do not leave quietly, I am calling security to have you physically dragged out of this building. You are trespassing." I slowly smoothed the sleeve of my silk suit, entirely unfazed by his threats. "I am not trespassing, Brandon. I have a formal invitation to be here." A sharp, cruel laugh echoed behind him. Vanessa pushed past Brandon, her gold gown shimmering under the chandelier lights. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and arrogant superiority. "An invitation?" Vanessa mocked, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of a few nearby guests. She crossed her arms, looking me up and down with aggressive contempt. "Please, you do not even have enough money to buy groceries for your children without begging our father for handouts. This gala is strictly invite only. It is exclusively for VIP city officials and the mysterious president of the real estate firm holding the Keystone plot. What right does a homeless, divorced, pathetic loser like you have to be standing in this room?" She stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to force me to step backward, but I held my ground. I stood taller. "You think you can just put on a rented suit and pretend you belong in our world?" Vanessa sneered, her breath smelling of expensive champagne and desperate anxiety. "You are a joke. Jamal is about to close a $10 million deal tonight that will solidify our empire for the next decade. We are the elite of this city. You are just the embarrassing relative we have to hide in the basement. Get out before I have you arrested." I looked at Vanessa, taking in the rigid tension in her neck and the frantic, wide-eyed panic hiding just behind her arrogant smirk. She was terrified. She knew Jamal was borrowing money from criminals. She knew their entire life was balancing on a knife edge, and yet her first instinct was still to crush me under her heel. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. "You should really be worrying about your own position as the Grand Lady of Chicago real estate. Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the music, "your empire is currently running on fumes and borrowed time." Vanessa's face tightened. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that your brilliant visionary husband is currently swimming in a pool of illegal debt," I replied smoothly. "You think Jamal is closing a brilliant deal tonight? Jamal is borrowing millions of dollars from violent, unregulated shadow lenders just to cover the extortionate price of a single piece of dirt. He is mortgaging your gold dresses, your mansion, and your entire future to men who will gladly break his legs when he defaults. You are not elite, Vanessa. You are collateral." Vanessa's breath hitched. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and shaking. She looked as if I had just slapped her across the mouth. Her arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The perfect lie she had constructed for her family was cracking open from the inside out, and I was holding the hammer. How do you know that Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words? Because I know exactly who Jamal is meeting tonight, I said softly. Eleanor stepped forward again, desperation completely overriding her anger. She grabbed my arm again, her nails digging in. Natalie, stop this right now. If you know something about Jamal loans, you need to tell us. The IRS has frozen our accounts. Your father's company is paralyzed. I told you on the phone you need to sign the equity transfer for your apartment tonight. You owe us. You have to save this family. I looked down at her hand, then looked directly into her frantic eyes. You still think I am here to save you, Eleanor? You still think I am the sacrificial lamb you can slaughter to keep your sinking ship afloat? I ripped my arm out of her grasp with a sudden violent force that made her stumble backward into Brandon. I raised the heavy black leather portfolio I had been carrying and held it up between us. I did not come here to save you, I announced, my voice slicing through the air like a blade. I came here to sign a contract. Jamal had noticed the commotion. He excused himself from the mayor and walked briskly over to our group, his face stormy and aggressive. He pushed past Richard and glared down at me. What is going on here? Jamal demanded, his voice thick with authoritative rage. Natalie, what the hell are you doing at my gala? I specifically told security to keep out the riffraff. I am waiting for the president of Obsidian Holdings, and I do not have time to deal with your psychotic family drama. Get out of my sight. I turned to face Jamal, the architect of my misery, the man who had manipulated my parents, stolen my inheritance by proxy, and paraded his stolen wealth in front of my face for a decade. He looked so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchable supremacy. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I did not blink. I did not waver. You do not have to wait any longer, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over our corner of the ballroom. Jamal frowned, confusion flickering across his aggressive features. What are you talking about? I placed my hand flat on the black leather portfolio. I am the president of Obsidian Holdings, I stated clearly, and I brought the deed to your property. The string quartet seemed to fade into nothingness. The entire ballroom held its breath. Jamal's eyes locked onto mine, widening in absolute paralyzing horror as the realization finally hit him. The trap had closed, and I was holding the key. Are you really prepared to finalize this transaction in front of everyone, Jamal? Or would you prefer to review the documents in private before I dismantle your empire piece by piece? Jamal stared at me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic bursts. The sheer terror in his eyes was intoxicating. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control. And now he was staring at the woman who held the detonator to his life. Before he could stammer out a response, a sharp burst of static crackled through the grand ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The master of ceremonies, a booming voice radiating from the towering speakers, commanded the attention of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, the crowd immediately falling into a hushed, respectful silence. We have reached the pinnacle of this evening. Please direct your attention to the main stage to welcome the visionary behind the Emerald Lake Project, Mr. Jamal Crawford. A tidal wave of applause erupted from the investors, politicians, and socialites. Jamal flinched at the sound of his own name. He looked at the stage, then back at me. I could see the desperate gears grinding in his head. He was cornered, bleeding out financially, and facing imminent ruin from shadow lenders. But his ego was a terminal disease. He genuinely believed that if he forced this transaction onto a public stage, the sheer weight of the audience and the presence of the media would pressure me into signing the contract. He thought I would cower under the spotlight. He straightened his velvet tuxedo jacket, his hands trembling violently, and shot me a look of pure, venomous defiance. You are going to sign that deed, Natalie, Jamal hissed, his voice vibrating with frantic aggression. You are not going to walk away from $10 million. You do not have the spine to ruin yourself just to ruin me. He turned on his heel, signaling abruptly to his lead corporate attorney, waiting near the stage steps. He marched toward the podium, bathing himself in the bright, blinding glare of the spotlights. Vanessa hurried after him, plastering her manufactured blinding smile back onto her face. though her eyes remained wide with unresolved panic. She stood a few feet behind the podium playing the role of the supportive wealthy wife. Richard and Eleanor remained frozen at the VIP table beside me. My father was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. My mother was taking rapid, shallow breaths, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a monster. I did not sit down. I simply stood there in my tailored silk suit watching Jamal step up to the microphone. "Thank you," Jamal began, his voice echoing across the cavernous room. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium to hide his shaking hands. "Tonight is a celebration of vision. It is a celebration of perseverance. The Emerald Lake project represents a billion-dollar investment in the future of Chicago real estate. We have overcome every regulatory hurdle, every zoning challenge, and every cynical competitor who tried to stand in our way." The investors cheered. I noticed the mezzanine lenders sitting 3 tables away, nodding in approval, entirely unaware that the man speaking to them was heavily leveraged with mob money. But to finalize this masterpiece, Jamal continued, raising his voice to project a false, overwhelming confidence. We had to secure the final piece of the puzzle, a single critical plot of land right in the center of our development grid. Tonight, that transaction becomes official. He gestured broadly toward his legal team standing at the base of the stage. The lead attorney stepped forward carrying a thick, leather-bound contract. "Today, we honor the presence of the president of Obsidian Holdings," Jamal announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "We honor the finalized partnership that will allow us to break ground tomorrow morning." Jamal pointed toward the back of the room, fully expecting his lawyer to walk toward the shadowed VIP booths where corporate entities usually hid. He expected me to quietly follow the lawyer to the back, sign the papers away from the cameras, and take the money. Instead, the lead attorney turned his back on the rear of the ballroom. The spotlight operator tracking the lawyer movements swung the massive beam of light directly across the room. It swept past the mayor. It swept past the city councilman. It swept past the billionaire investors. The spotlight landed entirely on me. The attorney walked briskly to the VIP table. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Eleanor. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, clutching the $10 million contract. He bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. "Madam President," the attorney said, his voice carrying clearly through the surrounding silence, "the $10 million buyout agreement is finalized and ready for your signature." A collective, synchronized gasp ripped through the ballroom. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the city stared in absolute shock. At the front of the room, the illusion violently shattered. Vanessa dropped her crystal champagne flute. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sharp, explosive sound echoed through the dead-silent ballroom like a gunshot. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of a stage monitor to keep herself from collapsing. The golden child was staring at the sister she had mocked, the sister she had called a homeless liability, suddenly realizing that I was the phantom billionaire holding the leash to her entire existence. At the table beside me, the blood completely drained from Richard's face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. He stumbled backward, his cane clattering to the floor, gasping for air, as the reality of my identity crushed his arrogant soul. Eleanor let out a high-pitched, strangled whimper, covering her face, with her hands trembling so violently her chair shook. Brandon stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, entirely stripped of his usual bullying bravado. I did not look at the lawyer. I did not look at the contract. I kept my eyes locked on Jamal. I stepped away from the table and walked toward the stage. The crowd parted for me immediately. The investors stepped back, creating a wide, unobstructed path. The security guards, recognizing my absolute authority, stood at attention. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the floor, counting down the final seconds of Jamal's life. I climbed the carpeted steps to the stage. Vanessa shrank away from me, pressing her back against the heavy velvet curtains, tears of sheer panic ruining her flawless makeup. Jamal stood frozen behind the podium, completely paralyzed. His charismatic mask was gone. He looked like a man standing on the gallows staring at the executioner. I walked right up to him. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. He did not resist. He simply let go, surrendering his power without a fight. I turned to face the glittering ballroom. The blinding spotlight illuminated my face. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, the panicking mezzanine lenders, and finally I looked down at my parents sitting in the front row watching their empire burn to ash. "Hello, brother-in-law," I said into the microphone. My voice was calm, clinical, and echoed with absolute authority. A deadly silence draped over the room. No one dared to breathe. "I am the owner of that 50-square-meter piece of dirt located right at the throat of your billion-dollar project," I announced, letting the words hang in the air. I turned my head slightly, looking directly at Brandon in the front row, then at Richard and Eleanor. 10 months ago, my family told me there was no space for me in their lives. I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, predatory register. They told me I was a liability. They told me I was a failure. They threw me out of their homes and told me I had no place in their world. I turned back to Jamal. He was actively weeping tears, carving tracks through the sweat on his face. "Today I am officially announcing that your project has no space to build." Either I declared, my voice echoing like thunder across the grand ballroom, "because I refuse to sell." The ballroom erupted. It was not applause, it was sheer, unadulterated financial panic. The mezzanine lenders in the third row immediately stood up, shouting into their cell phones, initiating the protocols to freeze Jamal's remaining credit lines. The venture capitalists began rushing toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from a dead project. "No," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking as he fell to his knees on the stage. "No, Natalie, please, you cannot do this. The shadow lenders, they will kill me. They will take everything. Please, I will give you 20 million. I will give you whatever you want. Please sign the contract." He reached out desperately, grabbing the hem of my silk trousers, openly sobbing in front of the entire city elite. The mighty titan of Chicago real estate was begging like a terrified child. I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, purifying heat of absolute justice. I stepped backward, pulling my clothing out of his grasp. "You should have checked the zoning laws, Jamal," I said softly, ensuring only he could hear me over the roar of the panicking crowd. I tossed the microphone onto the podium. I turned my back on the screaming investors, the weeping brother-in-law, and the golden sister who was currently sliding down the velvet curtains in a state of catatonic shock. I walked down the stage steps and headed straight for the exit. Eleanor tried to intercept me again. She lunged forward, her arms outstretched, her face twisted in a mask of ultimate desperation. "Natalie, wait. Please wait. The IRS, the house, you have to help us." Before she could reach me, two towering venue security guards stepped directly into her path, crossing their arms and blocking her advance. They recognized who held the real power in the room, and it was no longer the family throwing the party. "Ma'am, please step back," the guard ordered, his voice booming with authority. "Do not approach the president of Obsidian Holdings." Eleanor collided with the guard arm, bouncing backward with a pathetic, defeated wail. She collapsed onto the marble floor, weeping hysterically, finally realizing that the daughter she had thrown away was untouchable. I walked out of the Plaza Hotel and stepped into the cool, refreshing Chicago night. The black limousine was waiting. The chauffeur opened the door, bowing his head respectfully. I slid into the plush leather seat and crossed my legs. The sounds of sirens and shouting began to echo from the ballroom doors behind me as the financial collapse turned into a physical frenzy. The mob debt was calling. The federal auditors were waiting. The family legacy was completely, permanently erased. "Drive," I told the chauffeur. The limousine pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruins of their empire in the rearview mirror. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar, leaned back and watched the city lights blur past the window. The slate was completely clean. The revenge was absolute. I had finally claimed my space in the world, and I would never apologize for it again. The limousine had barely traveled 50 yards down the damp Chicago street when a frantic figure threw herself directly into the path of the headlights. My chauffeur slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. I leaned forward and looked through the tinted windshield. It was Vanessa. She was running blindly through the traffic, her heavy gold gown dragging through the dirty street puddles, her arms waving hysterically. Right behind her, struggling to keep up, was Richard. He was limping heavily on his cane, his face a mask of desperate panic. The commotion instantly drew the attention of the paparazzi clustered outside the Plaza Hotel. They swarmed the vehicle like sharks, sensing blood in the water, their camera flashes erupting in a blinding, chaotic strobe effect. I tapped the glass partition. Unlocking the doors, I instructed the driver. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped back out onto the cold street. The night air was electric with the frenzy of the media. They did not know the exact details of the corporate massacre that had just occurred inside the ballroom, but they knew a monumental scandal when they saw one. Vanessa did not even hesitate. The woman who had spent her entire life parading her superiority, the golden child who had mocked my very existence, collapsed directly onto the wet pavement at my feet. "Natalie!" she wailed, her voice a ragged, unrecognizable shriek. She grabbed the fabric of my silk trousers, her hands shaking violently. Her flawless makeup was completely destroyed, running down her face in thick, dark streaks. "Please, you cannot do this." Jamal's phone is already ringing. The lenders are outside the venue. They are going to kill him. He is going to be bankrupt by morning. You have to sign the contract. We will give you anything you want. I am begging you, save us. She was hyperventilating, kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a dozen flashing cameras. The entire city elite was watching her unravel. I looked down at her, gripping my clothes. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no pity. I simply felt the immense quiet weight of a closed chapter. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. "You were right, Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying absolute calm that cut through the noise of the street. "I am very impulsive, and my impulsivity costs exactly $10 million. I sharply yanked my pant leg from her frantic grip. "Enjoy living under a bridge." Vanessa let out a hollow, devastated scream, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her total destruction finally took hold. Her billionaire fantasy was dead. The Emerald Lake project was permanently frozen. With no land, Jamal could not dig a single trench. He could not build. He could not generate revenue. He was nothing but a hollow shell of illegal debt, and the violent men who owned that debt were coming to collect. "You vindictive, ungrateful witch!" Richard roared, pushing his way through the circle of photographers. He raised his cane, his face purple with absolute unfiltered rage. "You destroyed your own family." Before he could take another step toward me, the sharp screech of tires echoed down the block. Two unmarked black SUVs aggressively mounted the curb, completely boxing in my limousine. The doors flew open and 6 men wearing dark windbreakers stepped out into the flashing lights. Federal agents. I had not just given the financial files to the mezzanine lenders inside the ballroom. Before I even arrived at the gala, my legal team had submitted the entire forensic dossier directly to the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. I had given them the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the forged signatures. Richard froze, his cane hovering in the air. I turned to face the wall of media cameras, making sure every single microphone picked up my voice. "You want a statement for the morning papers," I announced, projecting my voice with lethal clarity. "You can start with Richard Wilson, the former manufacturing CEO who forged his daughter's signature to embezzle $250,000 from a protected family trust. He used that stolen money to fund his luxury lifestyle while attempting to leave a single mother bankrupt. The IRS has the complete ledgers." The reporters erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions. The federal agents moved in swiftly, completely ignoring the flashing cameras. Richard Wilson, one of the agents, stated, his voice flat and authoritative. "You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny." "No," Richard gasped, dropping his cane. It clattered loudly against the pavement. "This is a mistake. I am a respected businessman. You cannot do this to me." They did not listen. They grabbed his arms, pulled them firmly behind his back, and locked the steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The patriarch of the family, the man who had demanded total submission and punished anyone who dared to step out of line, was shoved roughly into the back of a federal vehicle like a common street criminal. Eleanor burst through the hotel doors, just in time to see the SUV doors slam shut. She let out a piercing, hysterical wail, falling against the velvet ropes as the federal vehicles sped away into the night. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her son-in-law was going to be hunted by the mob. Her entire social standing was reduced to a spectacular public humiliation. I stood in the center of the chaos, entirely untouched by it. I looked at the remaining investors standing on the steps of the hotel. They were watching me. There was no anger in their eyes. There was only profound, unadulterated respect. In their world, power was the only currency that mattered. And I had just orchestrated the most ruthless, flawless corporate takeover the city had seen in a decade. I turned my back on the wreckage and stepped into my limousine. "Take me home," I told the driver. The drive through the city felt different this time. The anxiety that had plagued me for the last 10 months was entirely gone. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, feeling the quiet, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. The limousine pulled up to the entrance of a towering, ultra-luxury high-rise in the Gold Coast district. I stepped out, greeting the concierge by name, and rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The doors opened directly into my new reality. It was a sprawling, immaculate penthouse overlooking the lake. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling glass showcasing the brilliant skyline. But the most beautiful part of the penthouse was not the view or the expensive furnishings. "Mom." The joyful shout echoed from the hallway. My 3 children ran across the hardwood floor, their faces lighting up with pure, unfiltered happiness. They collided with me, wrapping their arms around my waist, nearly knocking me over in their excitement. I dropped my black leather portfolio onto the console table and dropped to my knees, pulling them all into a massive, fierce embrace. I buried my face in their hair, breathing in the scent of them, letting the sheer warmth of their love wash away the toxicity of the night. "Did you win your big meeting?" my youngest asked, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. I smiled, kissing his forehead. "Yes, sweetie. Mom won. We never have to worry about anything ever again." I stood up, holding their hands, and looked out at the city below. I did not need the family that shared my blood. I did not need their conditional love, their toxic expectations, or their arrogant approval. I had built an empire from the dirt up. I had protected the only family that actually mattered. 10 months ago, they had laughed in my face when I had nothing. They told me I had no place in their world. They threw me out into the cold and expected me to quietly disappear. Tonight, I was standing at the very top of the world, and they were the ones who had absolutely nowhere left to go.